I'm Sudhir Pandey. I welcome you to Ahmedabad University and to the conversation series. Today's topic, as you know, is a very interesting topic, and for that we have invited the scholar who has written about it. So I will introduce Tripurdaman quickly. Dr. Tripurdaman Singh is a British academic postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, University of London, and a visiting fellow at the International Institute of Asian Studies, University of Leiden. He is the author of Imperial Sovereignty and Local Politics, the Bhadauria Rajputs and the Transition from Mughal to British India, 1600 to 1900, and 16 Stormy Days, the story of the First Amendment to the Constitution of India. His latest book is Nehru, the Debates That Defined India. So he's the best person to talk about this topic. So we are thrilled to have you, Tripurdaman, and thank you so much for joining us.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for inviting me.
The person who will be in conversation with Dr. Singh is Professor Ravi Miglani. He is the Professor of Practice of Management and Director of Executive Education at Ahmedabad University. He graduated from Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. And after that, he worked in the corporate for more than 3 decades. And after that, he chose to come back to academics, and he's contributing in several other ways. And he's an avid reader. And just to give a little clue, he met Dr. Singh in the Jaipur Literary Festival, and that is where they both met and decided to have this conversation. So that is one quick info to everyone. As I say, the way we host this, everybody will be muted except these two speakers, and they will converse, let's say, around 60 to 65 minutes. After that, we'll get back to question and answer. And for that question and answer, we request you to put your questions in everybody's chat box. We will curate those questions. And at the end of the conversation, 5 p.m. onwards, we would request you to appear on camera if it is convenient. Otherwise, I can take your questions on your behalf and ask both the speakers. If you are joining with your mobile, we request you to rename yourself. That will help us to identify you and ask you to appear on the camera or put your questions. So thank you so much. And I request now Professor Miglani to take it forward.
Thank you, Sudhir, and thank you, Tripurdaman, for finding time to do this. So let's start with 60 to 65 minutes is not enough time to talk about Nehru. Obviously, you're spending a whole lifetime talking about Nehru. So which is why we thought we'll just focus on one facet of Nehru rather than try and understand him holistically. So what we thought was hopefully relevant to our audience here is his leadership style and what can we learn from the leadership style of Jawaharlal Nehru and how that is relevant or not relevant today. Jawaharlal Nehru was a towering figure. He dominated Indian politics for more than 3 decades, from the 1930s till his passing in 1964. And he has since then been either praised or blamed, these days mostly blamed, for everything that has happened in India since. So his shadow looms over India even 6 decades after he departed. So everything today is either Nehru's blessing or Nehru's fault. So for a figure to dominate or be in conversation, a topic of conversation 6 decades after his passing certainly means that he left a huge impact. So some people love him, some people hate him, but no one can ignore him. And therefore, it is still a relevant topic of discussion. And one side tidbit to show how relevant he still is, as Sudhir mentioned, you and I, Tripurdaman, met at the Jaipur Literature Festival a couple of months ago. And the closing debate of the festival was Nehru remains the greatest prime minister of India. Now, to talk about, to close a large festival like that, with talking about whether Nehru remains or not remains the greatest prime minister of India 6 decades after Nehru is gone, shows that he still captures the imagination. And as you know, we had more than a full house for that debate. We had a stampede almost at the debate, hundreds or thousands of people there. There was also you were a panelist on that debate, of course, and As I've said to you earlier, I don't think I fully agreed with your position on on that panel, the side you took, but that's a matter for another conversation. So, for a figure so dominant as Nehru, for good or for bad, what can leaders today and tomorrow, and we have many students here, what can leaders of tomorrow, whether it's in politics or public policy or business or society, what can leaders learn from Nehru, or the good and the bad of that? So my open question to you, which I think you can hold forth on that question for 60 minutes, that one question is, what was Nehru's leadership style and what can we learn from it, using anecdotes? And you are a master of anecdotes. You've told so many stories about Nehru's interactions with others, which indicated his style of negotiation, his style of leadership, his style of carrying his point of view forward. So what was his style and why has it survived so long?
So, I mean, there's no doubt that Nehru was tremendously consequential. And just to quickly go back to that debate, I did argue the opposite side, but if you'd attended my panel, my talk the same morning, you probably would have heard me contradicting myself on a lot of the scores. But being that as it may, Nehru is tremendously, he's tremendously consequential. And one of the reasons that he's tremendously consequential is because he is a founding figure. He is given this sort of blank slate, or as blank a slate as it's possible to have in that sort of situation. And so Nehru really gets the opportunity to create a template for the future. He brings a lot of assets to the table. That is, he brings a reputation which he's developed by over 2 decades of involvement in the nationalist struggle. He, unlike a lot of his colleagues, to be honest, most of his colleagues, Nehru also has an interest in the international situation. So he's elected to the International Anti-Imperialist Congress in Brussels, alongside Albert Einstein and the sort of anti-imperialist Labour MP David Lansbury, and so on and so forth. He also, unlike all of the others, he is interested in what's going on in his neighborhood, especially in Southeast Asia and China. And one of the interesting points there is that even before he has any sort of executive position, even before independence, he hosts the first Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi, which kind of sets the template for India's engagement with Southeast Asia. I think this happens in February or March 1947. So there are a lot of things that being first off the block, really, so being the first person in that chair, really allows Nehru to do. It allows him to leverage all of these skills and networks that he's developed, all of the assets that he's sort of got to really position himself as the best person for that chair. And ultimately, that's why he's chosen, is because everyone acknowledges that he has a good working relationship with the British. He has international presence and charisma. He has experience, of multiple decades in the nationalist struggle. And he has, more than anything else, a sort of breadth of vision and imagination that not many of his colleagues seem to have or could claim to have. And that really makes him a sort of preeminent figure by the time independence comes around. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there was nobody else. That doesn't necessarily mean that he was all powerful. That only comes a lot after. So the first sort of lesson I would draw is his ability to kind of visualize where he would be, and his ability to really develop his skills and assets over decades. And one of the things that I mentioned in the Nehru book is how Nehru really prepared for something such as foreign policy, for over a decade before he had any executive power. Actually, he may never have had any executive power, but there was this sort of almost millenarian sort of self-belief that ultimately he would gain it. You see this even in the pseudonymous article that he wrote. I think it was published in the National Review, again in the 1930s, where he describes himself as saying, Jawaharlal might become a Caesar. And this is very far from independence. Nobody at that point could visualize when India would become independent, what form it would take, who would sit in the prime ministerial chair, whether there would be a prime ministerial chair. But Nehru has this sense of belief, and he has this vision, and he really sees himself sitting with executive authority, sitting on that chair decades ahead. And so for me, the biggest sort of leadership lesson that I've drawn from everything that I've looked at is this strong sense of belief, is the ability to visualize the future, and keeping that vision and that sort of belief in mind, the ability to develop his skills and networks to position himself for the leadership role. It's interesting to compare him to his fellow traveler in that sense, in the what was at that point seen as the left wing of the Congress, and that is S.C. Bose. Now Bose actually falls. And of course, commonly it's asserted that Gandhi really, Gandhi refuses to work with Congress and forces Bose's resignation, which in some ways is true. But the other part of the equation is that actually Bose was unable to have a working relationship with the Congress right wing. And the Congress right wing at that point was very strong. There were figures like Patel, Tandon, etc. And Bose is simply unable really to maintain a working relationship with them. And he's disappointed at the end that Nehru doesn't support him in his showdown with the Congress right. And the reason Nehru doesn't support him is because Nehru is, even at that point, a full decade before he becomes prime minister, really keeping his networks, keeping his relationships with everyone, so that he is not, unlike Bose, he doesn't become a fall guy. It's very difficult, even though he is on the left. The Congress right finds, doesn't really, because of his closeness to Gandhi, and because also, unlike Bose, he doesn't decide to have a fight with his own colleagues who are on the opposite side of the spectrum, at least not until he has achieved executive power and is in a position to win that fight. So for me, that is another very, very pertinent lesson which I've taken from him, is the ability to maintain these sorts of relationships, again keeping his sort of very powerful millenarian vision of where he sees himself 10 years, 20 years ahead as the leader of a free and democratic India. And the third sort of big lesson that I've drawn, of course, is of course his ruthlessness. I mean, Nehru is often projected as a very liberal, genteel sort of political figure, but he was anything but. People who didn't agree with the Nehruvian vision were sidelined and ruthlessly culled. Within a short span of time, everyone who was not of the Nehruvian bandwagon was either eased out or forced out of Nehru's first cabinet, whether it was Ambedkar, whether it was Mukherjee, whether it was someone like John Mathai, who very famously was among the first, actually, of the big ministers to resign, citing undue interference in his ministry, undue authoritarianism, and he was especially opposed to the setting up of this sort of the planning commission, which he thought completely undermined his role as finance minister. So Nehru had a strong streak of ruthlessness with which he managed both his cabinet and his party. You see this in the kind of forcing out of Purushottam Das Tandon in 1951, because he has widely been seen to be Patel's man, somebody who was not completely on board with the Nehruvian project, especially as in its sort of aspects that relate to secularism, and to the question of language, because Tandon is a proponent of Hindi. He is also widely seen to be a Hindu revivalist from the Congress right wing. And equally, you see it with Nehru's actions when it comes to questions of the unity and integrity of the state, most famously in Nagaland, where he unleashes military operations, and for which he creates a legal tool called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. You see this with the First Amendment, where he makes the argument that ultimately there are policies that he's identified with that the Congress has been promising to implement for 20 years, and now that they have the chance to implement them, they cannot be stymied by the Constitution. So there is a strong streak of quite ruthless determination that that characterizes Nehru's style of leadership. And for example, once Patel dies, with Patel, he's of course forced to share power, not as an equal, but as someone who he can't really bully or dominate. But after Patel's death, even after Nehru has had a stroke, even after his sort of functional ability has been quite drastically reduced, no other deputy prime minister is appointed. And after Nehru takes over the position as Congress president, for example, in 1951, after easing out Tandon, he keeps it for a couple of years. And then after that, you really have a tradition of, having the Congress presidency really sort of losing steam vis-a-vis Nehru. So all of the Congress presidents that come after him are not figures of substance, and by that token, power is thereby shifted from the sort of Congress hierarchy or the Congress organization to Nehru himself. So there's a lot of tendencies that were actually incipient, that one identifies really with Indira Gandhi in the 1970s, but actually have their beginning in Nehru and in Nehruvianism. So this quite ruthless determination with which he executes his vision, one could agree with his vision or disagree with it. As you know, I disagree with it quite strongly, but he was quite willing to see it through and to do what's needed to see it through. Now, he stretches the envelope. Despite all of this, he still continues to believe in procedural democracy. So you have elections, you have regular cabinet meetings, but you never have a situation where Nehru decides to short circuit procedure. So procedures, he's a big believer in proceduralism, and he does put in a lot of effort into making sure procedure functions as it should. So there are plenty of committees, there are meetings, everything is done as it should be done. He really stretches the envelope of constitutionalism, but at no point does he make the case that that procedure should be completely short-circuited, or that he should just be able to do what he wants without adhering to legal and constitutional procedure. Admittedly, that procedure gives him what he wants, so the temptation to short-circuit it is not really there as such. But it's still something to his credit that despite the sort of ruthless determination, despite, as he had written in that pseudonymous article about himself where he had said Jawaharlal might become a Caesar, despite that, all of that, and despite all of his contemporaries, if you look at the 1950s and 1960s in Southeast Asia, in Africa, very quickly the constitutional democratic project is thrown aside. Whereas Nehru, despite the temptation and despite the possibility, he never does it. He comes, maybe what he does is close to it, but at no point does he make that claim, despite both his nature, his temperament, and this sort of determination that he has to see his vision through. So I think those 3 or 4 points for me are really key to understanding Nehru as a leader.
Excellent. Yep. You've completely lived up to the billing given to you, that you'll go deep into the minutiae and anecdotes and specific instances, and then pull out and draw some big picture
But
leadership
if you
lessons.
would want a quick drawback that's from from his leadership style, I think one of his biggest drawbacks, and all of his critics really acknowledge that, including his ministers, was his propensity to exercise what is called Nehru's judgment. So to have policy effectively decided through his own sort of personal judgment rather than institutionalized mechanisms for the creation of policy. And the second was he was often called a dynamo, and his propensity to really try and micromanage everything, to interfere in the work of his ministers, to be interested in everything from what's happening in the finance ministry, or what's happening, who's going to receive the incoming minister for something from one of the maybe from one of the non-aligned countries, and so that often there was an inability really to focus on a few big things. And one of the reasons that Nehruvian policy making suffered because of this was Nehru was unable often to give the personal attention to all of the important things, because he was spread so thin.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I think you've kind of touched on many parts of the next question I was thinking of asking, but I'll ask it anyway. So in management circles, more than in political circles, in management circles where I and many of my colleagues work in, we sometimes define leadership on a spectrum from inspirational leaders. These are people who lead by sheer personality, charisma, kind of leading from the mountaintop, as we say, where the flock follows them, blindly follows them wherever they lead, because their charisma is so huge. And on the other end of the spectrum are hands-on leaders who do things, get their hands dirty. As you were saying, he was involved in the nitty-gritties of the different ministries. So leaders who lead by example, by doing things with their own hands rather than just leading from the top. Both of these extremes are caricatures. No leader is either purely standing on the mountaintop and leading by charisma, or purely executional, doing things hands-on and getting their hands dirty. So where would you place Nehru on this spectrum, and was that a good place for him to be in?
I think, well, there's elements of both, of course, as you mentioned, but Nehru was, in some senses, he was this sort of man on the mountain, but not necessarily something that he saw himself as being, but it's just something that he became endowed with by virtue of his position. Of course, he had this legacy, he had this reputation, and of course, he had no challenges. So there was no real sort of second layer of a clear sort of succession path, or second tier leadership that was expected to really succeed him. So in that sense, he was this sort of man on the mountain, but actually he was very much someone who liked to get his hands dirty. The problem for him was that he couldn't do it enough. So while he did dominate his ministers and he did interfere in all sorts of all aspects of policy making, he was never able to devote as much attention to all of it, as it's impossible. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of policy making in Nehru's period was so ad hoc and suffered from this, as I pointed out, this concept which is called Nehru's judgment, because it was basically left to the, after a burst of interference, it would be left to the ministers themselves to kind of interpret what Nehru really wanted. And then they would, for long stretches of time, be left to do to interpret it and do accordingly as they thought fit, because he really couldn't spare the attention. The only thing that did sort of really grab his attention was foreign policy in that sense.
Yeah, and that I think has become clear from your initial answer and expanded on here. So he was not, though, as legend has it, when there are great leaders, we tend to kind of glorify them and put a halo behind them and almost deify them, and therefore we gloss over their kind of day-to-day maybe pettiness or smallness or viciousness. Sometimes for leaders, we see them as being just the inspirational figure. So as it's a cliche to say, but that great men discuss ideas and petty minds discuss people. So was he an ideas person or a people person? Was he big on ideas, which we know he was? I mean, from all his writing and all his books, he had a vision. So was he driven purely by the vision, or he got petty at times and became people focused and rivalries and people and pettiness?
I think there was a strong streak of vanity. I don't think he was petty. He could be, very generous and very, he was. There's no denying he was very popular both amongst the public, and he was very good at managing his, political relationships. That's the reason he survived so long. But he very much was an ideas man. Now, the problem was that his ideas were. And again, here I would go back to the very famous critique mounted by the Marxist historian Perry Anderson, which is that Nehru's ideas were quite not the most sophisticated, and so Nehru had he had very fixed ideas, and a lot of those ideas were developed during his time in Britain, whether it was this affinity for Fabian socialism or for internationalism, which again is closely tied to, was in his case closely tied to socialism. And despite the practical setbacks that his policies often received, or the practical problems that they created, he very rarely did he change course. And so he was an ideas man, but I don't think being this sort of ideas man, and you, as you mentioned, you sense it through his books and through his writings, but these ideas were often not, how should I put it, they were often not that sophisticated, they were often not that successful, even while he was alive. And more than that, they often extracted a practical cost that he seemed to be willing to pay, even in his, because of this quite strong belief that these ideas would ultimately give success. Now, some would argue, and I sometimes do argue that as well, that a lot of these beliefs in these ideas were part and parcel of the making of Nehru the man, on the global statesman on the international stage. So some of this belief was, really actual belief in the idea. Some of this belief was also a method of, positioning himself on the global stage as Nehru, the great statesman, Nehru the great socialist, Nehru the great believer in Pan-Asianism, and so on and so forth.
Great. Also, building on that, again, coming from my and my colleagues' kind of commercial or corporate or management background rather than nation building and politics, is that we see in our businesses, at least, and I'm sure in politics as well, that there are, again, these are caricatures, and I'm sure everyone falls on the spectrum, but there on the extreme, there are what we sometimes in business call task-driven leaders who focus on the task at hand and are driven by numbers sometimes jokingly called management by Excel, where they just look at Excel sheets and base decisions on numbers, profitability, tasks, targets, goals, and not bother too much about the soft side of management, the people side. While there are others who we sometimes call the relationship-driven manager as against task-driven. Relationship managers are much more touchy-feely, more emotion-driven, more building relationships, what in management jargon we sometimes call management by walking about. They walk about, they chat with people, they build relationships, they ask about your family and children, and they kind of lead by building emotional relationship rather than purely being task-driven. So where would you place Nehru on that? Did he build emotional relationships, or was he ruthlessly task-driven?
No, he did build emotional relationships, and actually, you see this quite often, not just in his relationships. Of course, there's a famous example of Krishna Menon, who was his defense minister, but there are plenty of others, who were. The question about China, for example, a lot of it is to do with Nehru's emotional relationships with Nehru's own emotional sort of investment in China. He used to see it as a sort of, as a brother that he was going to read, going to lead towards a new dawn of socialist internationalism. So there was, or at one point when Nehru famously is upset because his Pakistani counterpart Liaquat Ali Khan is given the exact same treatment as him when he goes to the US, and it's one of the things, for example, that angers Nehru about how the Americans are behaving. Apart from his own sort of reflexive anti-Americanism, there's this idea that there's a refusal to acknowledge India's preeminent place, or his preeminent place in South Asia, or even in Asia itself at that point. So I think Nehru, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of practical considerations or practical feedback that he, for example, ignores, and the China policy is, of course, one of them, where this sort of emotional investment or emotional attachment often overshadows, as you said, the more task-driven side of things, or the more practical side of things.
So he would be kind of, was he kind of in the middle, or was he oscillating, like sometimes get ruthlessly task driven and other times get very touchy feely and emotional? Or was he always kind of, did he have a style which you could always see, or was he kind of confusing, like oscillating between the extremes?
I mean, given his position, of course, he would oscillate a bit, and I think, and everyone in that position probably would a bit. But there is, we often ignore the emotional side of Nehru, but Nehru was quite an emotional person. There's a very famous incident where in Delhi, and I think it was just around the time of partition, just after partition, where he goes and brandishes a stick and chases away a mob himself, and these are very emotionally driven responses. He was quick to temper. He was very impatient, but he was also very indulgent with people that he liked. He could give broad-based blanket support to those of his ministers and colleagues who enjoyed his confidence. Krishna Menon, of course, is the most obvious case, but there were also plenty of others, such as T.T. Krishnamachari and so on and so forth. So, of course, there was a degree of oscillation, but I would say that a lot of Nehru's responses were emotional, and Nehru was often emotionally invested in policies to an extent where he would find it difficult to really or deal with almost the practical considerations. And China is the most obvious example, but it's not the only one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I'll keep throwing some management jargon at you, so feel free to throw political jargon back at me. So one other buzzword in the leadership literature from a business point of view these days is authentic leadership. There's this belief that leaders should kind of open their hearts out and not keep a facade. In the old days and even now, a lot of leaders have a CEO leadership face, and then when they pack up and go home, they have a completely different face. And this two-faced leadership there's a lot of management gurus who say how this is not that people can see through it, firstly, and secondly, it creates a lot of stress where you have to keep up a facade in front of your troops, and then you have a different face in your weekends. And therefore, there's a lot of talk of being an authentic leader. Bring your whole self to work, as we sometimes say, and not pretend to be something that you are not, etc. So was Nehru authentic in that sense of the term? Or did he keep up an image which was, because you have had access, you've read a lot of the backstory and the correspondences and things that the general public did not know about. So from that, it looked like he was the same person behind the curtains, or was he a different person?
No, he very much was the same person. So of course, one of the things to remember about Nehru is that there was very little behind the curtain, especially after the death of his wife. He spent a lot of time in jail. Nehru had not that much of a private life. His life was mostly public. He spent most of his time in the public sphere. It was, in a way, his life was dedicated to the Congress Party, to the nationalist cause, and then later on as prime minister to governing the country. Walter Crocker, one of his biographers, who was an Australian diplomat, he was Australian High Commissioner to India for a while, knew Nehru personally. Has remarked in his book that oftentimes Nehru could be seen working late into the night in his study by himself. He's penned a portrait of Nehru as someone actually quite profoundly lonely and isolated, someone with few friends, and after the passing of Patel, few colleagues. Of course, passing of Patel, there was someone like Azad, but even Azad passed away much before Nehru himself. So if you were to go with Crocker's portrait, Crocker paints him out to be somewhat of a loner, someone who for someone who work really overtakes every other aspect of his life. So there's nowhere that Nehru can really, and of course he's living in the public eye. He's living in then Tirmurti, which is his residence. He's always on display. There are always people around him. There's very little private space for him to retreat to. So he, authentic or not, the Nehru you see is the Nehru there is. There's very little space for him to hide, and crucially, there's no real need for him to hide either. This is one of the things that's very noticeable about him, is that he's quite forthright and quite honest about what he's doing. So in Nehruvian correspondence, oftentimes if you read Nehru's speeches or his letters, they come across as very contradictory. So he would, be doing one thing, and one day he could argue completely the opposite the next day. And that's the reason, is that a lot of it is, of course, that he changes his mind depending on what he needs to do, but also that he doesn't really feel the need to hide it. So there's a lot of his ideas, a lot of what he's doing is he writes to his chief ministers, he writes to his colleagues. There's a tremendous amount of correspondence. One of the reasons that I could write the book on the First Amendment was that so much of what Nehru is doing, he's perfectly happy to be forthright about it. So there isn't that much subterfuge. Of course, given the nature of politics, you have to oftentimes, when you present arguments or make a speech in Parliament, you have to couch it in language that you think will gain you the broadest of support, and so on and so forth. But by and large, he's he there's not that much for him to hide. He doesn't really feel the need to hide it. There is very little private life at that point, after his wife's death. And a good example again is the pseudonymous article in the Modern Review, where he talks about himself, as someone who could become a Caesar, who has authoritarian tendencies, and so on and so forth. So actually, he's remarkably, I would say, authentic and honest and forthright individual.
So if we were to kind of put you on the spot and on this authoritarian versus Mody Democrat, was being democratic and being authoritarian or autocratic. So if we were to kind of ask you to compare him with a couple of his contemporaries, especially say Patel and Gandhi, would he come out as more democratic than either of those, or more authoritarian?
I think it's difficult to compare him to Gandhi because Gandhi's political vision was so different. Gandhi didn't. For Gandhi, the question of Swaraj, that is, was to be mediated through man ruling himself. And this is one of the things which makes Gandhi such an interesting political thinker, is that Swaraj goes beyond national freedom. It goes to the question of self-discipline. And for Gandhi, that self-discipline is ultimately what makes you worthy of national freedom. For Nehru, politics is much more, what I said, seen in the sort of Western idiom, in the language of constitutionalism and democracy. Now, I think both Nehru and Patel are both in that sense quite authoritarian. Both are strong believers in a centralized state, albeit for slightly different reasons. Both and Nehru especially believes in Nehru's committed to the idea of the social revolution. So whether that's Zamindari abolition, social reform, caste-based reservations, and all of these things that together constitute what Granville Austin called the social revolutionary strand of the Indian Constitution. They require a strong centralized state. That's what Nehru wanted, and that's what he got. And Patel also wants that, partly because he sees it as something to guarantee the stability and safety of the nation, to keep it united, and also to be able to for example, to integrate the princely states and make sure that any sort of fissiparous sort of tendencies are taken care of. And this, I sometimes call it almost executive despotism, enjoys broad-based support. Actually, you'll notice that there are very few people committed to the idea. Liberal democracy enjoyed very little support in practice. It was posited as a talking point to colonial rule, but it didn't really enjoy that much support in actual practice. And you see this in how the Indian Constitution turns out. So think of something like the power of the ordinance. The executive in the Indian constitutional structure is India's the only country, the only democracy in the world where the executive has lawmaking power. It can make laws without the need of the legislature by virtue of ordinances. It can do so without declaring an emergency, without there being any sort of emergency need. the second is the power to prorogue Parliament. Parliament is often prorogued by the executive and called back because there's no set sort of gap, for example, when Parliament needs to be called and when it needs to be sent back. The only constitutional stipulation is that between one session and another session of Parliament, you can't have more than 6 months elapse. So there, the Constitution is already, in a sense, I would call it a sort of in a way, it enshrines a kind of authoritarianism and executive supremacy. So both Nehru and Patel in this, there's very little to divide them. There's broad-based consensus on this, and all of India's post-colonial, sort of anti-colonial, the leadership of the Congress at that point is sort of committed to this vision. A liberal democracy enjoys, or liberal democracy of the kind that you associate with the West, or didn't enjoy that much purchase in India.
Okay, that was very clear. So thank you. So as we come kind of close to the end of our time, I would like to spend the next few minutes talking about the failures. Like all leaders, what can we learn from his failures, or things that he did not get right exactly? So there's been a lot of talk, and I, as a layman, have been reading or hearing about it for decades, of how he kind of messed up on one of the core features of a leader. One of the core kind of qualities of a leader is to build a succession plan to ensure the stability of the organization or the nation through smooth transition and succession planning. What was he able to do succession planning well, or was it clouded by his desire, hidden or stated, to get Indira to succeed him? Was there such a desire? So what happened with the succession planning?
I mean, it's hard to say whether there was that desire. He didn't express it, he didn't express any sort of obvious desire for Indira to succeed him, but he did, he did introduce her to politics. He did, keep her by. She was his, companion for so many years. She met global leaders. She was in the thick of things. It's not as if she became Congress president during his lifetime. So ultimately, he did very much position her to be able to enter politics at a high level after him. Whether there was an obvious desire for her to succeed him, I couldn't really say. But it is true that there wasn't that much succession planning. Of course, you had the Kamraj plan, where leaders that Nehru didn't really like were kind of eased out to do organizational work. And so I guess there was some sense of who would be in positions of executive authority when when Nehru went. But there was very little obvious sort of succession planning, and it's quite clear that there wasn't, because as I said, for example, Nehru never designated a deputy who would be the obvious choice to succeed him if even after he'd had his stroke. He never really made any choices clear, although it was widely seen in and the more interesting aspect of this is to look, if you look at diplomatic correspondence in the 60s, when diplomats, especially British and American diplomats, are speculating as to who might succeed Nehru, because by that point he's post the 1962 war. It's quite obvious that the Nehruvian era is sort of coming to an end. The succession is imminent, and some people, despite his pro-Western orientation, it turns out that British and American diplomats aren't particularly keen, for example, on Morarji Desai succeeding him, even though Desai was widely seen as a strong contender, because they think Desai lacked the capacity to keep the Congress party together, that the Congress left wouldn't accept him, and that he might even cause the Congress party to sort of split down the middle. The coming of Lal Bahadur Shastri as Home Minister is widely seen as positioning him as a possible contender, and the Kamraj plan was widely seen as removing people that Nehru didn't particularly want to be close to power when the moment arrived. But he never had a sort of obvious, clear-cut succession plan, and I think partly that was because he didn't want to designate a successor. Partly also, I think he didn't want someone to upstage him while he was alive. I mean, both of those strands of thinking, are present and are worth considering. I think you're still muted, Ravi.
Yeah, and that sounds so familiar in the corporate world. Leaders always avoid having a very clear succession plan because they are sometimes insecure that the successors will kind of upstage them during their lifetime or during their stint, rather than wait for their turn. And by the time their turn comes, it's too late to do succession planning, and then there is a mad scramble and there's a period of chaos before one new leader emerges. So that happens all the time. So I don't know whether we've learned anything from that or not. So one last failure, as it's seen by a lot of people, before we open up to some really excellent questions that have been coming up on the chat. So we'll get to questions in a couple of minutes. The other generally acknowledged failure was his failure to understand China and kind of not be prepared for the debacle of 1962, and not having enough trust in the army and not building up the armed forces to be prepared for the. So first letting China kind of get to that situation where China was brave enough and bold enough to do that, and not having the army ready to fight back. So was that a failure, and why did he not take more interest in that area?
Well, this is quite a complicated question. So I ask that you give me sort of a few minutes to run through the several strands involved in it. The first is that actually the first big question arose on how India conceptualized its relationship with China. And this failure was not just Nehru's, but if you look at, I mean, the correspondence coming in from the first Indian ambassador to China, for example, K.M. Panikkar, who once compares Nehru to Mao and says both are people of high-minded ideals with a lot in common, and so on and so forth. So there's and of course, this plays into Nehru's own xenophilia, because he sees China as sort of this great civilization which is now awakening, and India and China are together going to define the Asian century. And of course, he's already predisposed towards socialism and towards Marxism, because he sees it as a force that's anti-imperialist by virtue of being anti-capitalist. It's also anti-imperialist, and he has a sort of pet peeve against the Americans. He doesn't like them. So all of this already, I said, emotionally disposes him towards a particular view of China. The second is his image in the world as Nehru, the sort of great socialist, and Nehru as the global statesman. This is a period where both this the communist world effectively describes Nehru as the hireling of Anglo-American imperialism, and even within India, you have the communist parties arguing that actually this freedom that India has got is some sort of trick that the West has played on it. So the famous slogan was "Ye azadi jhuti hai," meaning this freedom is false, and actually India is still somehow dominated by the Anglo-American bloc, and Nehru is called the hireling of Anglo-American imperialism. So to in a way protect this image that he's cultivating and has developed as a global socialist statesman, and also this image of India being a sovereign democratic country that's free of colonial rule and is not in the pockets of the West. Nehru bends over backwards to try and counter these communist allegations from the Soviet Union and from China. And the way he does it is by constantly, I guess, taking Chinese concerns into consideration. So even when China in 1950 walks into Tibet, the Indian argument is not that India's concerns are being swept aside, because at that point, India, for example, unlike China, which had never signed the Shimla Treaty, India had recognized Tibetan sovereignty. It had a special relationship with Tibet, including a small military presence and all of those things. The Nehru government doesn't argue that, for Indian interests. The argument it makes is that this, and you see these in diplomatic notes that are being exchanged, is that actually this will make it more difficult for India to press China's case in the United Nations and on the global stage, which Nehru and India are at that point doing. So Nehru has positioned himself as China's foremost spokesperson on the global stage, and in the United Nations, where Communist China at that stage doesn't have a seat. And he's done it because to counter, of course, the argument that he's a hireling of Anglo-American imperialism, but also the argument he then makes against the Chinese invasion of Tibet is that not that the Chinese are doing anything wrong, but they're making it difficult for India to press China's case in the UN. So all of this sort of emotional investment in China and in his own image as a sort of socialist leader, and his investment in the idea of Asian solidarity, causes Nehru to greatly, I guess, misjudge the Chinese situation, but also to diplomatically position India in a very strange way, because the only way they can help Tibet, and you see this in his exchanges with Patel, because Patel argues that actually China's walking into Tibet raises profound questions on how Indian diplomacy is conducted. So he says that it leads to a necessary reevaluation of India's relationship both with the West and with the communist bloc. And for Nehru, this is a bit of an anathema, because he sees aligning with the West is confirming the communist charge that he is India is still not free, and B, aligning with an ideological force, that is with global capitalism, that he sees necessarily as the cause of colonialism and the cause of war. So for him, all of these points sort of come together and cause him to really misjudge the course of events. But he doesn't, of course, he sees war as an impossibility. And he sees war as an impossibility both because socialist countries don't go to war with each other, but also because he sees the Himalayan frontier as something that can't be breached. So in his notes, he often says, well, there's no possibility of war, so let's not think about that. But he is aware that there is a security threat. It's also important to remember that India at this point is an incredibly poor and in sort of on pure material terms, it's not doing particularly well. so a lot of what Nehru does is also a way, I guess, of trying to find non-material ways of diffusing the crisis or of engaging with the crisis, because to find material ways is also, in a sense, to acknowledge that actually India, unlike what India presents itself on the global stage, it doesn't really have the material resources for conducting this foreign policy, for being this sort of global diplomatic player involved in the Korean conflict, involved in Africa, and so on and so forth. And Nehru, for better or for worse, tries to use his his own image as a global statesman to kind of bridge this material gap. And so there is a more practical consideration into why he's invested in this image as well. And in some senses, it's not a completely people think that Nehru is being a complete fool in his dealings with China. I don't think that's the case. I think there is an awareness of the material deficiencies, and there is an idea, a very how should I put it, risky idea of using, I guess, somehow seducing China into not making good on its claims on Indian territory by proving to them that we're their friends and their well-wishers. It's not a very wise strategy, but it is a thought-out strategy. It doesn't come from a place of no thinking. It doesn't come from foolishness or stupidity.
Okay, yeah, that was understanding China in 7 minutes was an amazing feat, Tripurdaman. I know understanding India's China policy needs a whole other webinar. Maybe we'll do that sometime. So we will open up to questions, but before that, one last question in a bit of a lighter vein. Asking you for a one-word answer. So picking up on that debate topic from Jaipur, so what is your current answer? Does Nehru remain the greatest Prime Minister of India?
Well, okay, that depends on how we define greatest. So I would definitely say he was the most consequential. But to call as greatest I would always say greatest is a question of assessing whether how much one did and what one achieved with the cards that were dealt to you. And I think on that token, I wouldn't define Nehru as the greatest, because given the cards that he was dealt, I don't think he gave us the best outcomes. But he certainly was the most consequential, and I certainly don't believe that he was some sort of evil figure out to do bad, as the caricature is often given out in public discourse. So I would stand by my argument that I do not consider him the greatest. But that's not to say that he was not the most consequential.
Okay, that's a suitably diplomatic answer. Okay, I think we need to open up now because we have so many good questions. So Sudhir, would you take the questions over now?
Yes, we have a long list. So thank you so much for that. I think you were explaining or answering every question. By that time, I got a lot of questions from the other side of the audience. So if Vinayak is here, Vinayak, I would like you to come on camera and ask a question. If you're able to unmute yourself.
Hi, Dr. Singh. Thank you so much for the enlightening talk. This is a topic which is bound to elucidate many questions, as Professor Pandey has just put it. And I'm a fifth-year scholar, a PhD scholar at IIM Ahmedabad, and I've been listening to this talk with a lot of interest, because I belong to Allahabad, and my house is not very far from Pandit Nehru's house. Is hardly 1.5 kilometers or so from where he was born and raised. So coming from that kind of a cultural background, I would like to ask you that what is your view on this apparent skepticism that Pandit Nehru is many times accused of having, of the traditionalist lobby in Indian politics. So a lot of to what extent is it true that his leadership style, his positions on certain issues, majorly domestic, not international, were coming from this skepticism of the fact that if he lets go, it would mean a sabotage of the issue by the traditionalist lobby in the Indian political economy. Would love to have your views on that. Thank you.
No, he had quite a disdain for the traditionalist lobby. If I was to be straightforward, he didn't think very highly of him, and he had a disdain for religion, all religion, and he had a disdain for traditionalism. And he was very much one of these people who believed, for example, the cabinet mission plan to which Jinnah had agreed, which was the last sort of constitutional proposal to keep India united, comes apart when Nehru gives a press conference saying that actually the Constituent Assembly, after it meets, is no longer bound by the agreements that have been signed, outside it, or agreements that have been signed between the British and the Congress and Jinnah, because it's a new sovereign body that's giving birth to a new country. So Nehru is someone who believes very much in this vision, and modernity, or I guess a particular kind of modernity, is something that defines Nehruvian thought, whether it's this push for what he calls rationalism, whether it's disdain for the more traditional sort of elite, caste-based elite, landholding elite, the princes, traditional religion, Hinduism to a large extent, also Islam. And he does really see himself as holding the fort, because actually through his political journey, whether it was the 1930s and the 1940s, the Congress right was a very potent force. It's only through a fortuitous set of events that actually Nehru ends up in the executive chair through Gandhi's intervention, and through a very fortuitous set of events. It could very easily have been on the other side, or if maybe the Congress right had, while Patel was alive, decided to have a showdown with Nehru, who knows what would have happened. So he's very aware, yes, that if he isn't the driving force for this sort of modernist project, then there's a good chance that the project itself will fall apart. So I don't think he was entirely wrong there either.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Actually, what you've said is actually, the kind of detailing that probably I was looking for, because we do feel that, but coming from a scholar, it definitely, reaffirms that belief. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Vinayak. Now I would like to invite Professor Tana Trivedi to ask her question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the conversation. It's been absolutely wonderful listening to you. My research is currently on the princely states of Kathiawad and Saurashtra. So I'm looking specifically at the narratives that emerged from 1930s and 40s. And when I go through all the writing that largely comes from that region, I find Nehru almost entirely missing in almost all their conversations. And what the princely states are really looking at is building some sort of a confederation, a federation of Indian states, right? And then, of course, everything just changed by the time that we gain independence. There is Sardar and there is Menon, and they're everywhere, and they're consolidating and they're amalgamating the states and bringing them all together. So I've been very curious about what has Nehru's relationship been with these princely states. You mentioned some of it, in passing when we were in a question that was asked before this by Vinayak ji, when he was asking you about your views about about how he felt about these traditionalist sort of an approach. But really, where can one even look for conversations where Nehru talks about the princely states, or he's talking about a traditionalist approach, or he's looking at, the princely states? What really did he have to say about them and inclusion of them in the New World Order?
That's a very interesting question. So I'll start by saying that actually Nehru disliked the princes. He made no bones about that. And so if you go back, say, 15, 20 years before independence, actually you have the Congress's original policy was that they were not going to interfere in the princely states. That sort of changes with the arrival of Nehru, with Nehru taking over as the president of the All India States People's Conference. You have a more interventionist policy through the from, I think it's from 1930 onwards. And the question of federation and confederation begins with the Roundtable Conference, where the federal scheme is brought in. And initially, the princes are very keen on the federal scheme. They're keen on the federal scheme because they think that it's a way of them escaping paramountcy. So they have been strafing and pushing back against British control for all of these years. And in these quite convoluted negotiations that happen, one of the key sticking points is mainly because of Nehru, which is the weightage of seats in the central legislature, because and the method by which legislators from princely India or from the Indian states are going to be elected to the legislature, whether they're going to come through a form of election, whether they're going to be nominated by the princes, whether they're going to, and then in another big sticking point is in the federal scheme is the weightage that's how princely India is going to relate to British India. The princes want a full 50% of the seats in the Council of State. Nehru isn't willing to give more than, I think it was 33%,
yes,
or maybe it goes up to 40%.
Percentage.
So it was something like that. So Nehru is quite involved in this process. Again, a key differentiating point is the princes engage with Patel, right? And I'm talking about the period around the Roundtable Conferences. There are several meetings that happen between office bearers of the Chamber of Princes and between Patel, but also some of the other figures, the sort of senior Patel, and then the Sardar, and then also with Sapru and the sort of more liberal traditionalist political wing in British India. And there are all of these things going on, and actually it's a very workable sort of scheme. Ultimately, the British want to set up a central legislature. They want to progressively Indianize the political setup, and the goal, as Irwin has declared right at the beginning of the Round Conference, is the granting of Dominion status. So actually, far from anything else, there is a constitutional move to progressively kind of hand power over to Indian hands, in which the big intervention comes neither from the Congress, nor from the princes, nor from the British, but it comes from the war in Europe, because Linlithgow gives the princes 1st September 1939 as a deadline for accession. But of course, by then, 1st September 1939 is the day that Germany invades Poland, triggering the Second World War, and then people's attention gets diverted elsewhere. And by the time political action move, of course, you have the Quit India movement and all of these things. And by the time you come back to 1946, really, the entire sort of makeup of the political scene in India has changed, as you would know. And even here, finally, when the question of the integration of the states comes up, Nehru is actually one of the problems. So a lot of the princes have personal animosity with Nehru. For example, Hari Singh of Jammu and Kashmir. And one of the stumbling blocks to the negotiations is that people are worried about what Nehru will do. The princes are worried about what Nehru will do. So they find it easier, and Patel leads that semblance. He gives assurances to the princes. Those assurances are incorporated into the constitution, so on and so forth. But also, I disagree. There is a strange positioning in the literature of Patel and Menon, but actually the big figure here is neither Patel nor Menon. It's actually Mountbatten, the overweening, the person most responsible for the, I guess, the quick and clean fall of princely India is actually Mountbatten. It's neither Patel nor Menon. The key figure is Mountbatten, who's doing it for a variety of different reasons.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think it is very interesting when you look at Nehru and Patel working together, and, Patel like largely handling all the princely states, and with over 200 in Gujarat itself. And you find Nehru missing almost entirely from those conversations, which is where my question to you. But
you also find Mountbatten missing from those conversations.
Absolutely,
because the man who actually pulled the rug from the prince's feet was Mountbatten, and he did it in a way very much against the advice and against the inclinations of the political department, which was actually very pro the princes. So Mountbatten is also missing from the literature.
There is minor mention of Gandhi, but practically no mention of Nehru or Mountbatten also. So thank you so much.
Sudhir, can I come in for a minute here? Thank you, Tana, for raising this question. And we kind of anticipated your question. And to answer your question in more detail, we are getting Manu Pillai in our next webinar 2 weeks from now. I'm sure you're familiar with Manu Pillai, and I'm currently reading one of his books right now. So he will answer this question in much more detail. Because as we know, a lot of the late 19th century to mid 20th century history has largely been the British Empire and the directly ruled part of the British Empire and the nationalists and the Congress. The princes were often dismissed as puppets and people interested in big palaces and big cars, and they were not taken seriously, but there was a lot going on there. And Manu Pillai, as you know, Tripurdaman and Tana, has been writing a lot about the...
In fact, they were, a lot of states were very progressive also. So,
so written about Travancore.
The ministers were very progressive.
So two Saturdays from now, block your calendar. You will get a much more detailed answer on this.
Thanks, Ravi.
Yeah, Dr. Singh, I fear that we have to cross 5:20 and 5:30, and I request your 15-20 minutes, not more than.
Sure. No,
but I assure that I would like to kind of wrap it up by 5:45. So now I would like to invite Prosenjit to ask his question. If you can switch on your camera and ask a question. Yeah, Prosenjit Das Gupta. Yes. So you're still muted.
My point is that in assessing leadership, you need to take into account. Are you able to hear me?
Your voice is really feeble, so I think you need to.
Okay.
And you're also on the camera, so you need to just be away from the camera.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Better?
Yeah.
As I said, leadership of any sort, whether it is political leadership or business leadership, would necessarily have to be considered in a certain historical context. The context, let us say, in which Mr. G.B. Birla or Mr. J.R.D. Tata functioned in the field of business, or Gandhi or Nehru or Sardar Patel functioned in the political sphere. Secondly, political leadership has certain dimensions which are somewhat quite challenging. For instance, in India, Nehru or Patel, or for that matter, Gandhi earlier, had practically 300 million stakeholders to satisfy or to explain their ideas to. And as you know, political leadership is much about communication. Of course, leadership in general is about communication. To communicate one's ideas, one's vision, whether in the field of business or in the field of politics, is a prime requirement. I wish to just conclude by saying that Nehru, or for that matter, even Sardar Patel or others, have to be assessed or understood or appreciated on the basis of their historical context. To begin with, Nehru, well, he was a Kashmiri Pandit. The first thing off, one has to understand the history and background of Kashmiri Pandits in order to be able to appreciate what Motilal Nehru or Jawaharlal Nehru was likely or did actually feel at a point of time. Secondly, Nehru was, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru was very much influenced by the company of the great leaders of the time, whether it is Lala Lajpat Rai or it is Gopal Krishna Gokhale earlier, and later, of course, Gandhi himself. And he had his sort of a liberal education in Harrow and in Cambridge, which no doubt influenced him. Dr. Singh has also mentioned about his connections or affinity to Fabian socialism.
Yeah, I'm sorry to intervene since I have a long list of people to ask questions.
So I think
with the interest of
address this point, I would be grateful.
Sure. Yes. I mean, you're completely right that historical context and personal background are very important. And of course, we only had a limited amount of time to run through all of these points. But yes, his formative experiences in Britain, his links with people such as Harold Lasky and so on and so forth, are very important. His involvement in global anti-colonialist enterprises, I'd mentioned the Anti-Imperialist Congress in Brussels, but also his travels through Europe, his early exposure to the Soviet experiment, which disposed him, which kind of really disposed him well towards planning and Soviet-style industrialization. So all of these things, yes, are very important, and unfortunately, we didn't get time to kind of touch through all of those things, but they are very important to determining the context and to Nehru's ideas.
Yeah, thank you. Now I would like to invite Professor Raghu Rangarajan to ask his question.
Thanks, Sudhi. Could you share a little bit more on the relationship between Nehru and Ambedkar, both before independence and particularly after independence? You did touch upon it briefly when you mentioned that Ambedkar left the cabinet, but if you could say more about that.
I mean, before independence, I'd struggle to talk too much about it because it's their relationship is one that I haven't really looked at in all that much detail. But after independence, I'm very happy to talk about that sort of part of their relationship. And so the interesting thing is that actually Ambedkar is first elected to the Constituent Assembly with the support of his friends, especially J.N. Mandal in Bengal, with the support of the Muslim League. He's not, and then when, of course, partition is decided on and partition happens, Ambedkar actually loses his seat in the Constituent Assembly. And then he's brought back from a seat in Bombay where I think someone had died or someone resigns, and he's brought back on the insistence of Patel. So actually, Ambedkar and Patel share a much closer relationship, I feel, than Ambedkar and Nehru. Partly it is their shared belief in the power of sovereignty. Ambedkar in that way is not very far off from Patel in his view of how sovereignty and power are to be wielded. In a sense, he, like Nehru and also like Patel, believes that, in the presence of a commanding state, in this sort of top-down process of social reform. In that, there is general alignment. You see this when the big question of the First Amendment comes up. Ambedkar actually argues very forcefully in Parliament, both for what he says is the doctrine of implied police powers, drawing on a sort of American constitutional concept, and on the necessity of the state having these legal tools and powers, and so on and so forth. But behind the scenes, even though in public he is arguing for Nehruvianism, behind the scenes, there's often Ambedkar often feels isolated. He feels isolated because Nehru has not really involved him in the kind of committees, the important committees, whether it's the cabinet, in the sort of important cabinet committees that meet and decide on major things. Ambedkar feels that he is a sort of political lightweight, which in some senses he is. He feels isolated. He feels that he's not really given all the information. He's not given that much responsibility. And so you have this progressive buildup. He disagrees with Nehruvian foreign policy. So if one was to go to the statement that he gives Parliament on resigning, one of the, apart of course from the Hindu Code Bill, which he's upset about, one of the big points that he raises is that Nehruvian foreign policy is causing him a great deal of anxiety and worry, because India is getting isolated in world affairs. It's having to spend a lot of money on defense. It has no allies. He says it very clearly. When they became independent, everyone loved them, and then within a few years now, we have no friends in the world. Ambedkar shares a slightly strained relationship with Nehru, and I think it gets further strained after the death of a figure like Patel, to whom many people who disagreed with Nehru could turn for political support and succor. And there's an interesting series of letters where Nehru criticizes Ambedkar for, he takes Ambedkar to task for criticizing the Congress, and he says, even though you're not a part of the Congress, while you're in the cabinet, you're supposed to more or less act as a Congress member, and so on and so forth. So they share towards through 1950 and going right up to the end till about September 1951, when Ambedkar resigns, the Nehru-Ambedkar relationship gets further and further strained, partly because Ambedkar disagrees with a lot of what goes for Nehruvianism, but partly also because he feels progressively sidelined, as treated as inconsequential, not given substantial responsibility, and really kept out of the inner circle of the Nehru cabinet that is really deciding on things.
Thank you. That was very clear. Thanks.
Now I would like to invite Mubarak Ali to ask his question. Mubarak, if you can. Yes, so please go ahead, Mubarak.
Good evening, Ananda. Respected sir, thanks for your invaluable insight. Extending my sincere thanks to organizer for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to read your book, sir. My question is, what are the 3 leadership principles of Nehruji will adapt to the 21st century leaders or for the future managers? Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would. I think one of the things, of course, is Nehru's almost childlike curiosity that he has about the world around him. So he, it's something that is very easily taken both to the 21st century and beyond, is to be curious about the world and to be able to engage with the wider world with that sense of curiosity, to learn more, to discover more. So that's definitely one. This second, of course, is I mean, there'll always technology. Nehru is fascinated by modern technology and by the possibilities that modernity offers, whether it's through the questions of sort of more enlightenment flavored questions of rationalism and science and scientific temper and so on and so forth, or the more technical aspects, big dams, big industry, steel plants, and I think that sort of belief in the possibilities of modernity and the possibilities that technology offers us is again something that really translates well into the 21st century. For me, those two really stand out.
Yeah, thank you. And now I would like to invite Shruti Doshi to ask a question. Shruti, if you are there, if you can unmute.
Hi. I'll actually thank you for this amazing session. I'll directly ask my question that I have mentioned. Can we draw a parallel between Nehru and Modi of their ability to set a strong personal and political narrative in India, which resulted in extreme support and extreme criticism during their respective eras? So in this regard.
Sure. Actually, I think there's a lot of there's a fair bit of meeting ground between Modi and Nehru, and that's not just down to their sort of strong personalities and their ability to dominate the political sphere, but it's also many of their core beliefs, whether it is the idea that of the strong executive, whether it's this sort of quite support that there can never be any sort of challenge to the unity and integrity of the nation state. Even this sort of call for self-reliance, it's in a way quite Nehruvian in its outlook. And also the way that really that they communicate. There's a very there's a great sort of self-belief that both bring to the table. They both seek to shape the modern nation state in their sort of image. A lot of the current political project is posited as a sort of undoing of Nehruvianism. And the idea, of course, is because Nehru really did shape the state in his own image, and the idea that, and very much of the current political project is reshaping it in a sort of new in a new image. It's the first time that Nehruvianism is being repudiated, I guess, or attempting to be repudiated in that form. So I think there that way is a lot of meeting ground, and. For years, Modi has been criticized, for example, for the misuse of sedition, for I guess, in a sense, mounting pressure on the press and so on and so forth. But again, as I've argued in my books, these are not new things. These are incipient sort of tendencies that you see kind of appear right at the outset, at the dawn of Nehruvianism. And in a way, even this, even in foreign policy, the idea of the multipolar world, the idea of strategic autonomy, they're not that far off from non-alignment and or from many of the key kind of elements that define Nehruvian foreign policy. So I do think there's a lot of meeting ground, but again, there's obviously a lot of differences as well, and you could also argue the opposite.
That's true. This is like you touched upon all the points that I was thinking in my head. Thank you for answering this question.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. In fact, the long list of questions are unending, so I would request people to refer to your book and other articles that you've written. Otherwise, it will go on. So now I would like to invite Professor Miglani to conclude.
Thank you, Sudhesh. Thank you, Tripurdaman, and thank you to everyone in the audience who listened patiently to us and to ask such insightful questions. Not very much to close in terms of remarks. Tripurdaman has given us a very well-rounded picture of Nehru, and that in fact is the lesson that I draw from it, that in today's hyper-polarized world where we tend to see things in black and white, and we either put a leader on the pedestal or we put the leader in the trash can, and there's no middle ground. There's so much polarization, and we learn from this that there is no black and white. There are several shades of gray between the black and the white, and as there's a cliche that we hold multitudes within us, everyone, including Nehru, had multitudes within him. And he was good and he was bad all at the same time. And that, I think, if in today's social media driven frenzy of either making someone a god or making someone a villain, if we can learn that from this discussion, that there's no gods and there's no villains, everyone is somewhere on that spectrum, and so was Nehru. So that was my one learning from this, amongst many others. So thank you, Tripurdaman. You have anything to leave our audience with before we close?
So there's first, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you to everyone who attended. And I hope they found something of interest in our conversation. One of the key, I guess, during all my time of reading, working with Nehru, one observation that really struck me was given again by Walter Crocker, one of his biographers, who wrote that the Indian people had, and throughout his life, they never lost the belief that Nehru was actually, acting in India's best interest. That he had the nation's good at, in his heart, and I think that's to me that was. It was a very revealing quote as to why he won these huge majorities while he was alive, why he was such a big figure. And equally, I think there is, the lady asked a question about where there is meeting ground between Mody and Nehru, and I think this is one of the key aspects, that a large majority of citizens have this belief and haven't lost this belief that actually whoever's leading the country has its best interests at heart, regardless of what the actual outcomes of their policy might be.
Thank you. So Sudhir, you can close the session now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as I said, we are grateful to you. And whenever you visit India, we would love to host you at our university, Ahmedabad University. That would be really great.
The pleasure would be absolutely mine. And thank you so much once again for inviting me.
Yeah. And we are also thankful to all those people who joined on Saturday afternoon from 4 to 6, and they remained and they asked such interesting questions. So thanks everybody. Take care and good night.